Hello and welcome to the latest Science Insights from New Scientist. I'm Rowan Hooper, joined today by Penny Sarche, as always.
Hello, how are you?
Well, I'm good, except I'm sort of wishing I was in Svalbard.
Well, you've got that itch, have you? You want to go...
It's a yearly thing for me now.
Yeah, because you did go last year,
I did.
You?
Svalbard in the high Arctic. And the reason I'm bringing it up rather awkwardly at the beginning is that New Scientists are going again this year in June. We've got the whole ship. We've chartered the whole ship. It's this really lovely expedition vessel. It goes through the sea ice. Richard Dawkins is coming, and there are just 14 cabins left on this cruise.
Wow, that sounds really amazing.
It was amazing. Polar bears, walruses were my favourite animal. Saw them up close. Amazing. So anyone interested, go to newscientist.com/tours and you'll see the Arctic trip.
Okay, on with the show. We've been reporting on some really interesting stories this week. Coming up, we're going to discuss the phenomenon of climate whiplash, what it is and its role in the LA wildfires, and how we're seeing it more and more. And we're also going way back to the 1960s and hearing from the world's first chatbot.
Let's start, though, with a paper out this week in Nature. It's a really nice example of what modern archaeology does. In other words, it's genetic archaeology, and it shows that in the Iron Age, Celtic tribes revolved around women.
Yes, this is so interesting. So this comes from a study from excavations of the remains of the Durotriges tribe at Winterbourne, Kingston in Dorset. It's an Iron Age burial site, basically just a 2,000-year-old cemetery, essentially. And so then genetic analysis of the remains there suggests that in this society, married women stayed in their ancestral homes while it was husbands, it was the men who sort of moved in from other communities, and that this practice lasted centuries.
Yeah, so the lead scientist on the project was Lara Cassidy at Trinity College Dublin. She said that was a real jaw-dropping moment for them. And she said this was a clear signature of matro-locality, or husbands moving to live with their wives' families. And that's a pattern she says we'd never seen before in prehistoric Europe.
It's quite amazing, isn't it? I think there's often this narrative that women were sort of sent away, almost like chattel. So that's why it's so interesting. And the work supports growing archaeological evidence that women had high status within Celtic societies across Europe, including Britain. And it also gives credence to Roman written accounts that were often thought to be exaggerated for Mediterranean audiences, where they described Celtic women as empowered, but that's kind of been dismissed since.
Yeah, amazing that probably male historians dismissed these accounts of empowered women in those days. So to discuss this story, we're joined by Rachel Pope, who's a reader in European Prehistory at the University of Liverpool. Rachel, thanks for joining us. Can you put this into context for us?
Yes, of course. I think one of the things that I've been asked over the last couple of days is, am I surprised? And as an archaeologist of Iron Age Europe, I'm not surprised, really. So we have been uncovering evidence for sort of non-patrifocal societies across Europe for the last 20 years. And gradually we've been recognising that there are sort of very high status women in some of these communities, that there are female founder burials in some of these cemeteries, that there's gendered burial clusters, so a very different way of depositing the dead. And then last year in southern Germany, we had the first evidence for matrilineal descent patterns in Iron Age communities. So it's a new piece in the puzzle, and it's a very exciting one because the focus here is matrilocality. So people are returning to traditional burial grounds to bury the women in the communities, which is very exciting.
I mentioned a moment ago there that there's these Roman texts that about empowered women in Celtic society that since we've said were exaggerated. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of them. So the Roman texts, we have mention of kind of female inheritance. We have, characters like Boudica and Cartimandua, who, Cartimandua is very exciting, sort of getting involved in very shady political sort of backstabbing stuff. So we knew there were kind of high status women from the Roman texts. We've subsequently in the 20th century kind of critiqued them, said, well, this is all about the barbarianization and so on and so forth. But I think as we've been looking at big data in the archaeology, we're beginning to realise that maybe it wasn't so far off the mark. And when we actually look earlier at the Greek texts, we begin to see evidence of mention of war leaders, several war leaders in the middle part of the Iron Age. And, Plutarch talks about the women of the Celts being the judiciary in certain sort of political circumstances. So there's an awful lot there. We haven't been open to reading it in the same way that perhaps we are now.
But what went wrong, Rachel, when women had all this status and it was eroded?
Well, Rome came along, didn't it? So yeah, I think we in our modern societies have been very keen to read the classical texts and understand a kind of male-centered society as the norm, as the natural, as the universal. And the more we look into ethnography, the more we look into prehistory, the more we really, focus on pluralistic readings of the texts, we're beginning to recognise that actually we've got quite a lot of evidence for very different types of society that didn't always privilege a particular sector of that society. And the variation is the bit that's really exciting. So in Iron Age Europe, we have the French evidence, which does seem to suggest sort of matrilineal social forms archaeologically. But then in Rhineland, we have martial men as the high status burials. In Bavaria, it's elder men, but they're not buried with weapons. They're buried with toilet sets. So they're interested in sort of, looking after their moustaches. So, we're looking at different societies with different social norms in different places across space and through time. And with the ADNA science, we're beginning to see some of the detail of that. And that's what's really exciting.
So ADNA meaning archaeological DNA?
Or ancient DNA.
Ancient DNA.
No, I mean, we can rename it that. That would be great. No, it's
ancient. Okay.
It's ancient DNA. Okay. Yes.
That's really interesting about you talking about diversity, especially across geography, because in this study, there's data showing that sort of one of the men who'd come into the society was from the Netherlands, who was a Dutchman or whatever it was called back then. There's also evidence of a Dorset man subsequently being buried in France. Like, what's going on there? Is it surprising to see people roaming so far?
No. I mean, we've known this in archaeology for a very long time. We've got the ideas moving large distances. We've got objects and artifacts. We've got architectures moving. We can see the material remains of those travels. What we haven't been able to do previously is plot the individuals. And I think that's what's so exciting about this, is that we've got that Dutchman and we've got that Dorsetman, and they're moving geographically, and we can see that. But what's also really important is that this is confirming what archaeologists over the last couple of generations have been saying, that this isn't mass migration. This isn't fast social change. This is individuals moving, traveling, going to see their cousins, having a baby somewhere, moving back. They don't always end up buried where they've been. So, we're seeing the individuals in their final resting place, but we have to kind of, resist the temptation to think that means that they had a restricted life. Where they buried does not represent the scale of their travels and their interactions and the movement of them and their ideas.
And Rachel, at the start, we said that the study shows married women stayed put and the men moved around. But you were saying to me before that basically marriage is an anachronism for Iron Age times, right?
Yeah, that's not to say that, there wasn't cases of kind of heterosexual monogamy, for sure. We do know about those from the texts. But Caesar also mentions that Iron Age Britain engages in polyandry.
Did he mention that disparagingly? Was that a bad thing in his mind?
It was an observation.
Oh, okay.
It was an observation. So, and he describes it. And polyandry is always women with more than one sexual partner.
Yeah.
And also, the fact that we don't see burial according to kind of spousal arrangements, that there's these kind of gendered clusters. There are double burials for sure, but oftentimes those double burials are same-sex individuals. It's not showing a signature of kind of Christian marriage systems. Yeah.
Now, about matrilocality, I asked Rebecca Wragg-Sykes about this, and she's an archaeologist. She's the author of Kindred, about the Neanderthals, of course, and a forthcoming book called Matriarcha about women in prehistory. She said we should stop being surprised that women in prehistory should have power and autonomy. And here's what else she said.
When we think about matrilocality versus patrilocality and what that actually means in terms of who has the power, women or men, if women are having to move when they get married, I think we actually tend to, when we talk about this, even if we are identifying as women are the ones who are moving, we flatten their agency by sort of only referring to it and thinking of it in quite a restricted form of it's marriage. They are sort of marriage pawns. They're being sort of traded by the men who are in power. And in fact, that is assuming that women are unable to be active participants in that, to negotiate, to create these social alliances, and to be in control of that themselves. Even in a context where you might assume it's patriarchal and women seem to be following this sort of patrilocal pattern of movement, we mustn't remove or sort of erase the potential agency that they had even within those contexts as well. But in relation to this new study, I think it's another case where it's telling us to stop being surprised that the past did have powerful women, did have women who were the focus of authority and value and status.
Rachel, another thing that strikes me about this is, can we tell anything about what Celtic society was back in the day? Like, was it all over the British Isles and then it kind of got pushed back into Wales and Scotland and Ireland? And what about language?
Yeah, the linguistic side of things is really the next exciting field of discovery, I think. We're dealing with the remnants of language in Britain that is pre-English, pre-Latin, and that has been given in the 18th century the term Celtic. But what we're beginning to realise, what Barry Cunliffe's recent work showed, I think, relatively convincingly, is that the origins of these languages were not located in the Iron Age, that they were at least Bronze Age in origin. And Barry Cunliffe was quite clear, I think, that they had potentially deeper prehistoric roots. Under that model, I would not see Celtic language arriving in Britain or being brought to Britain, but I'm fairly sure that prehistoric people would have had language in Britain before the Bronze Age, before the Iron Age. So it's a similar project, really. We need to move away from these, 100-year-old ways of explaining change, the idea that mass migration or mass movement brings change, to understanding that mobility is the main social mechanism of change. And it's not rapid, it's cumulative over deep time.
Okay, let's talk about wildfires and climate whiplash and also the hottest year on record.
Yeah, a couple of things to get into here.
Just a few.
And, we've got the Palisade, the LA fires. I was talking to a friend in the Palisades the other day. She'd been evacuated, but they were all staying inside because of the fumes are so bad. And then I've seen people talking about this recently, that the wildfires aren't really wildfires anymore. They're urban fires, because all the sofas and furniture burning is sending up this acrid, really toxic smoke. So that's just another angle on this, or another element to this disaster. Our reporter James Deneen is here. James, you've been reporting on the climate whiplash effect that Penny just mentioned. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, I just want to say there have been finally some gains in fighting the fires in Los Angeles, but it's still likely to be the most expensive wildfire in California history. I think more than 25 people have been killed, more than 10,000 structures damaged. And a major reason these fast-spreading fires have been so damaging is a very unusual sequence of weather extremes that led to basically perfect fire weather conditions. That started in the winter of 2023 into 2024, which was wet, and all that water boosted vegetation growth. Then heat and drought through 2024 dried it out. Then that dry weather kept up into the winter, long past the regular fire season, when powerful Santa Ana winds start blowing, fanning the flames. Normally it's wet enough by the time those winds arrive to dampen these explosive fires, but this time it wasn't. And that sequence is an example of what's sometimes called weather whiplash or climate whiplash, where some area sees a sudden or extreme swing between wet and dry conditions. We can't be precise about the LA fires yet, but it's clear that weather whiplash is becoming more common with climate change in general.
Yeah, there was a recent paper on this in one of the nature journals, wasn't there?
Yeah, in Nature Reviews Earth and Environment, this study looked at whiplash events in climate data stretching back to 1940. And since then, the researchers found whiplash events within a particular season have become between 33 and 66% more common, depending on the data set they're looking at. Whiplash within the time frame of a year has increased between 8 and 31%.
Right, and that's just since 1940 over this very gradual warming. And we're going to hear in a minute about how we've now breached 1.5 degrees since pre-industrial times. And the models show that with future warming, we could see an even bigger jump in this weather whiplash, climate whiplash.
Yeah, they project with 3 degrees Celsius of warming, these seasonal events over land more than double, and annual events increase by half.
And it's not just the wildfires, is it? When you get this volatility in dry and wet, you can get swings from flooding to drought, and it can impact agriculture. And we've seen this in the UK when we've had lots of hard freezing and then flooding and the crops get washed out. And then you can have an impact on disease vectors and a swing between, mosquitoes and rats or something. So, yeah, none of this is a good thing.
No, it's not. I will just say it's a bit complicated what leads to more whiplash in particular places. But the overall driver of this change, the researchers say, is hotter temperatures, which enable the atmosphere to hold more moisture. During wet periods, that means more extreme precipitation. During dry periods, it means the air sucks up more moisture from the land.
It's really starting to feel like we're getting personal experiences of those big extremes just from one thing to another. And we've got Madeleine Cuff here. Maddie, you've been writing for us about the jet streams and how we seem to be getting stuck and everything's all wobbly. We'll put a link to that in our show notes. But today you're here to talk about 1.5 degrees because there's now data confirming that last year, 2024, was the first year to sort of breach that 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial warming.
Yes, it was the climate news that everyone knew was coming, and we were just waiting for the confirmation from the World Meteorological Organization last week. It's important to say that although 2024 was the first year where average temperatures were above 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, that doesn't count as a breach of this global agreement not to breach 1.5 degrees. That's a clause of the Paris Agreement because that global goal is measured on a 20-year average. So we have to be on average above 1.5 degrees. So individual hot years don't quite make the threshold. But this is the first year in human history that we have had global temperatures go this high. So it is a really stark reminder, in case we didn't need one, that our planet is rapidly changing. And this 1.5 degree target is now very probably out of reach.
And so, if people have seen reports that we've now broken this or breached this, that's not officially true because of this kind of lag of averages. But we probably won't have to wait 20 years to know whether we've reached the limit. permanently or not?
We reported on a really good rule of thumb that some researchers came up with last year, which was that if we have 3 individual years where the average global temperature is above 1.5 degrees, then we can assume with reasonable certainty that the target is lost. So 2024 counts as the first year of those 3.
It's like strike one.
Exactly.
Maddie, is there a sense that warming's becoming non-linear in the sense that, it has been going up steadily, but now it might be going up in jumps and might be going faster than we expect?
Yeah, there's kind of 2 questions wrapped in one there. So since 1970, you're right, global warming has proceeded at a roughly linear pace, but now we're getting some evidence that this rate of warming is accelerating. Models did project this, but we're now starting to see it in real-world data for the first time. And I'll just give you a quick example. The abrupt increase in temperatures from 2022 to 2024, that's when we've seen this massive surge of heat all around the globe. That's the largest 2-year increase in temperature since the 1870s. So we really are seeing a big jump up in the pace of change. And there's a few factors at play, and scientists roughly know what's going on here. Obviously, we've got continued greenhouse gas emissions from human activities, but another big factor is the reduction in sulfate aerosols, which has come about as part of efforts to crack down on air pollution. And that basically means the world can now absorb more heat for the same amount of pollution. There's also the role of El Niño, which is a change in Pacific water temperatures, which has the effect of basically pushing up global temperatures. And there's a school of thought among some scientists now that instead of temperatures returning back to normal once an El Niño pattern has faded, essentially an El Niño acts to kind of level us up to a new threshold of warmth, which would imply that although 2024 was the first year above 1.5 degrees, it won't be long before we see another year at that level or even warmer.
One thing about this particular crisis and the reporting on it, and obviously it's because it was in LA, is, well, did you get the sense that there were more, I heard more human stories? And that's not to say that humans haven't been impacted really badly around the world, but that they seem to, maybe it was more people had phones and were just uploading, I'm losing my house. And, it in some ways, this has kind of humanized the crisis in a way that other events haven't. And people might say, well, that's just because it's happened to rich Americans. Now we care about it. But did you get a sense of that at all?
Yeah, I think when disasters like this strike in very densely populated areas, you're going to get a real sense of how human society is impacted by these disasters, which I think hits differently to when you see, as tragic as it is, parts of the Amazon on fire, because you can see directly the impact that this has on human lives. I think there's some saying that, the climate crisis feels distant for a lot of us, but gradually we'll start seeing it recorded through phone screens, and then it'll be your friend who's recorded something, it'll be a family member who's caught up in something.
And then it'll be your house.
Before you find yourself doing the recording, you're managing the phone screen and capturing the evidence live. So it kind of is becoming increasingly close.
It reminds me of last year when the wildfire smoke came to New York City. And, that was huge headlines. Wildfire smoke is something that's been going on for a long time, but suddenly when it hits this massively populated place where it's completely visible, it sort of shoots the attention level way up.
And I had family members caught up in the Valencia floods. And, that was the first time for me that it felt really close to home, because suddenly, I couldn't get hold of people who I knew were in a really affected area, and it felt very close to home in a way that, just reading about something on the news. And we, a lot of us will know people in LA or have been to LA. So I think that's why that feels slightly more kind of connected to what we're seeing.
I don't want to be accused of trying to find a silver lining here at all, but do you think that has the potential to shape climate deals to some extent? Because a lot of the problem is that it's the poorer nations who are massively more affected. As richer nations start feeling it more, could that lead governments to be more sympathetic?
I like to think that it might have an impact, but I think we've got to remember that the factors for all of these events are complex. And yes, for all the case that climate change was a major driver of the fires in LA, there are also other aspects at play, like how equipped the fire service is, how prepared residents are, how we've constructed our cities. So there's never going to be one clear culprit that everybody can agree on to blame, and particularly with the way modern information is communicated and, you know, the agendas of certain politicians. I don't think we can say that, you know, this event will lead to this political outcome. I don't think it's as straightforward as that.
Now, Penny, have you heard of Eliza, the world's first chatbot?
Yeah, I think I remember reading about this at some point.
Yeah. Well, so the story this week is it's been resurrected. It's,
oh, really?
Yeah, well, it's a thing from the 60s. It was written. It was basically a prototype psychoanalyst program. It's only 420 lines of code, written in the 60s by someone at MIT called Joseph Weizenbaum. And the idea was, what he wanted to do was use it to explore how people interact with computers. And to his surprise, though, people started kind of believing they were conversing with a human.
So already passing the Turing test.
Well, that's what some people thought. They definitely, you know, gave it human attributes, and they sort of thought it had character and stuff like that.
So was he exploring how people relate to chatbots, or was he trying to make a psychotherapist, or both?
I think, well, maybe a bit of both, actually. But other people certainly did say it could be used in a psychotherapeutic setting as well, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I think it's really funny how whenever we have these advances in like artificial intelligence, like even now we're jumping straight to, well, can we use this as therapists? Yeah. It's happening all over again, isn't it? People do believe that ChatGPT is sentient.
Yeah. Well, that's the funny thing, that ChatGPT is very impressive, but this thing, we look at it now and it's not so, but people back then did. And look, I've got the original source code here.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I thought we'd give it a go live. It says, "Hello, I'm Eliza. I'll be your therapist today." I'm worried Penny will think this is a waste of time.
Unfounded.
Let's see what she's... I said she.
Yeah.
Do you believe it's normal to be worried Penny will think this is a waste of time? I think it's a normal fear. Do you really think so?
Oh.
This is
not super helpful, is it?
Well, it's only 420 lines of code, you know, but it at least it responds in a reasonable way. Let's just say I'm worried about net zero. Did you come to me because you're worried about net zero? Amongst other things. Yes. Let's explore that a bit more. It says. So look, you get the idea.
Yeah, Ali, it didn't automatically ask you to talk about your childhood.
Well, it might have come to that, yeah. Let's explore that a bit more, is opening the door to that.
Yeah, of course. So it just so happens that this week I saw a story in the New York Times about a woman. She basically trained ChatGPT to be her virtual boyfriend. And I know that sort of sounds a bit like it's sort of a trashy, voyeuristic piece, but actually it really explored these issues of how we sort of project meaning and an emotional connection onto these bots. But anyway, I thought, Rowan, you'd enjoy the intro to the story. It read, "A 28-year-old woman with a busy social life spends hours on end talking to her AI boyfriend for advice and consolation on the ChatGPT app. And yes, they do have sex."
Ew!
It's a good lead, isn't it?
It made you click on it.
Yeah.
What's interesting also is that Weizenbaum, who wrote Eliza, later reflected on what he did by giving it this feminine name, and you fall instantly into the trap, like I just did, of referring it to as her. And he later criticised himself for that because it gives this implication that this sort of emotional therapeutic support is something inherently feminine.
Yeah.
And there's a bit of a theme here, but going back to the Celtic women.
Yeah. Well, of course, like, you know, Alexa and Siri, there is a real pattern of seeing these sort of device voices as female, isn't there?
Scarlett Johansson voicing the...
Yeah, exactly. I guess if women are using AI as their boyfriends, is that a strike for equality, or does it just muddy it even further?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment on that, actually.
That piece on the resurrection of Eliza is by Matt Sparks, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. That's all for this week. Thanks to all our guests, and thanks to you for listening. Do tell your friends about us and give us a 5-star rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
And we'll be back next week. Bye for now.
Bye.